Hello, everyone. This is week 10 for education and inequality. We will be reviewing kind of what inequality and stratification are, and then closing it off with the various ways that we see inequality occurring in education, and from intersecting with the criminal justice system to the ways in which schools are even set up or the ways in which grad schools are set up and more. So let's dive in. First, just as a reminder, social stratification is a system that divides society's members into categories. Largely in the US, we talk about things like wealth and prestige. And inequality is based on that stratification system. How are there unequal distributions of resources, opportunities, and rewards? Now, when we talk about mechanisms of inequality, what we're thinking about is the process by which something takes place. And so education is a mechanism of inequality and stratification. For example, just 5% of college students in 2013 were in poverty, whereas 28% of those who didn't graduate from high school were in poverty. So education is a mechanism of stratification in the sense that those who are able to get a college degree are less likely to be poor, and those who do not get a high school education are far more likely to stay in poverty. So what are some of the ways that education becomes a mechanism for inequality? Funding, high property value neighborhoods, for example, those where the wealthy live, have better publicly funded schools. Tracking. Schools often track individuals into advanced versus low achieving groups that determine who gets into the best classes, who gets the best resources, and that determines a lot of how students will succeed in and outside of school. The hidden curriculum. So these are informal norms and values that individuals need to understand to succeed in the classroom. If you were fortunate to grow up in a household that had, for example, a teacher, and you learned those norms and values before other students, it would seem that you were already more successful, more capable. Access. Who can participate in the educational system? Throughout the world, we know that a lot of countries do not allow women or do not allow certain other groups to get an education. In cultural capital, similar to the hidden curriculum, it's the knowledge that helps you navigate the culture and will alter your experiences and opportunities. All of these are discussed in the textbook, by the way. Credentialism is the status hierarchy of degrees in educational institutions. As we just saw, those with a bachelor's degree have a higher status than those without a high school degree. But you also have differences in education, right? Did you go to an elite private school? Did you go to a public school in the inner city? Did you go to a really well-known college or one that isn't well-known, or a community college? That changes how people go throughout school and how education can increase inequality. You watched Monique Morris, who is the author of Push Out, talk about how schools often engage in criminalization. Criminalization is the act of constructing or labeling people as criminals and putting them into the criminal justice system. She describes how Black girls are overrepresented in school discipline throughout the U.S. Part of this is because of age compression. Black girls are often seen as more adult-like, and there's an assumption that they need less help or empathy and have more experience with sex and sexuality. So like if you have a rounder body shape, you must be trying to have sex. Things like that are often stereotypes pushed on Black women in the U.S. And this leads to more frequent and severe punishments, as well as the cultural norms of dress and hair standards in school dress codes often already criminalize and punish Black girls. And she argues that schools should bring students closer and bring them in, discuss with them, help them, and stop using these rules as ways to push Black girls into the criminal system. So this is an example of how education can become a mechanism in inequality. The other piece you will read is racialized organizations. You're reading a short piece that summarizes the idea of racialized organizations and applies it to medical school. But in essence, what they're trying to say is structural racism is a systematic racial bias that's embedded into normal laws and social relations. Um, it does not mean that it is a racist law, that it was intended to be racist, but often that the outcomes have a disparate racial impact. So a racialized organization is when structural racism is enacted through formal and informal organizational processes that privilege certain racial groups. And so we're going to see how medical schools act as racialized organizations in that their seemingly race-neutral structures negatively impact experiences and outcomes of racial and ethnic minorities. So first, the authors talk about how the MCAT and other admission requirements often are based on cultural norms and values for communities that grew up wealthy. They also talk about how underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities lack the opportunities to do, medical or doctor shadowing and other extracurricular activities that are privileged in admissions. So even though they're not any less capable or competent, because they didn't have these opportunities that require social connections, money, you often see racial and ethnic minorities not getting into medical schools. Second, culture and climate. This relates to the hidden curriculum and the cultural norms we talked about earlier, that those who have friends and family who are doctors already know some of the cultural norms and beliefs and practices that are valued in medical schools, leaving the others at a disadvantage. And also, it creates the assumption that you should know them before you come into the classroom, even though they are things that these people just simply happen to be taught before they got into the classroom. Further, they remark on how many microaggressions and stereotypes are commonplace in medical schools and are not regulated, or no one speaks out to stop them, and so they continue to go about. Mentorship, that racial and ethnic minorities report a lack of effective mentorship, and there's a lack of racial or ethnic representation. And so it's less likely that they will find someone who will guide them on their pathway. And then finally, that even when racial and ethnic minorities have the similar level of academic ability or test scores, they are still less likely to receive high honors or other status symbols or awards, making it harder for them to go into, more prestigious jobs or more advanced fellowships or even get jobs. So each along the way, even though race isn't necessarily explicitly a requirement or a way of teasing out who gets in and who gets awards, race and ethnicity often plays a part. And so these unspoken race-neutral rules and processes affect racial minorities worse. So over the last 3 weeks, this is what we've been looking at, is how families, education, and deviance have created a part of the social stratification system that we are in today. Next week, we will be moving on to systems as a whole and looking at how systems function. I have an example of the work you will be doing in the discussion posts. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you. We'll see you next week.